At these words, moving aside the tapestry, Sinbad preceded his guest. Franz now looked upon another scene of enchantment. The table was splendidly covered, and once convinced of this important point, he cast his eyes around him. The dining room was scarcely less striking than the room he had just left. It was entirely of marble, with antique bas-reliefs of priceless value, and at the four corners of this apartment, which was oblong, were four magnificent statues, having baskets in their hands. These baskets contained four pyramids of most splendid fruit. There were Sicily pineapples, pomegranates from Malaga, oranges from the Balearic Isles, peaches from France, and dates from Tunis. The supper consisted of a roast pheasant garnished with Corsican blackbirds, a boar's ham with jelly, a quarter of a kid with tartar sauce, a glorious turbot, and a gigantic lobster. Between these large dishes were smaller ones, containing various dainties. The dishes were of silver, and the plates of Japanese china. Franz rubbed his eyes in order to assure himself that this was not a dream. Ali alone was present to wait at table, and acquitted himself so admirably that the guest complimented his host thereupon. "Yes," replied he, while he did the honors of the supper with much ease and grace. "Yes, he is a poor devil who is much devoted to me, and does all he can to prove it. He remembers that I saved his life, and as he has regard for his head, he feels some gratitude towards me for having kept it on his shoulders." Ali approached his master, took his hand, and kissed it. "Would it be impertinent, Signor Sinbad," said Franz, "to ask you the particulars of this kindness?" Not a fan of this, but let's just not make too big a deal of it. We're acknowledging the caricature of Ali in this situation. We're going to get a longer story about him tomorrow. I don't want to dismiss the importance of acknowledging the characterization, the toxic racial characterization that's happening here. It's so layered, too, because it seems that Dante is acting as a sort of white savior while adopting this Eastern cosplay vibe. And I wish I had better experience and knowledge and understanding to convey to you the complexities of what's going on. Factoring in the fact that Dumas himself is of mixed race creates a whole complicated story here that I don't feel adequate to go into. So acknowledging that, and I will be doing my own research to better understand this. I highly recommend that you do that as well. Maybe we can have a discussion about that and educate each other on Discord. I would deeply appreciate that. Let's just take the story for what is being presented to us. Franz continues his astonishment at what is being presented to him. Dante continuing to present this kind of international melange of food and decor. Statues in the corners holding baskets of fruit in their hands, the fruit being from Sicily and Malaga and the Balearic Isles and France and Tunis. How did he get marble into this cave? Why? Why would you do that? As I joked a few episodes earlier, this does really seem like Bond villain stuff. You're building a lair inside of a mountain. This is straight out of Dr. No. But let's continue with what we were talking about yesterday. I realize I have thrown the name Auguste Mackay at you and haven't followed up on that yet. Hopefully it's giving you some time to do your own research so that you can hopefully maybe correct me when I do speak to it before the end of this chapter. But I want to talk about Romanticism. I want to continue that and talk about Dumas' place within it. In fact, it might even segue us well into the Auguste Mackay conversation. So while Dumas is described as a romantic writer, but he comes in fairly late to the game. And while he's definitely of the romantic school, he has some other things in mind, particularly, let's call it commercialism. He is a romantic writer in subject matter, but he's very modern in his execution of it. So, for instance, some of the romantic traits that Dumas uses in his books, and again, I have finished reading The Three Musketeers at this point and can confirm in that book and this book, as tonally different as they are, they share intense emotional stakes. Characters experiencing betrayal, loyalty, revenge, these capital T themes. Heroes are not shaped by fate, they're shaped by action and injustice and reaction to injustice. There's a sort of generational trauma, I think is a modern term you would apply to it, but the idea that the past can still affect and wound the present. I'm sure that comes from Dumas' relationship with his father. His father, as I've mentioned before, being a general in Napoleon's army, having a falling out with Napoleon, being imprisoned, dying early into Dumas' life. There's a large shadow, especially having the name Alexandre Dumas and being a Alexandre Dumas Jr., essentially, that his father looms large over his career. But that sentiment falls very squarely into the romantic ideas of kind of, I wouldn't say chaos, but it's not logical, it's not reason, and it's not order, right? Those are messy things to deal with the past. And I think there's a sort of moral passion rather than a philosophical approach. It's like philosophy tends to, unless you're careful, it tends to abstract what you're writing. And I think that Dumas prioritizes the passion rather than the philosophy of his stories. But one thing that Dumas does differently is that he is really promoting momentum and pacing of his story, clarity, and as I said earlier, commercialism. He wrote for mass audiences, not literary elite. He's not necessarily writing to other romantic authors of the time in order to further the core attributes of what romanticism is. Throughout history, you get a lot of these situations where a group of artists congregate somewhere and they're all working on massive works that then influence one another, and they are in conversation with one another. And Dumas isn't not that, but I think he's more interested in if it's not entertaining to the general audience, then what's the point? I think a good comparison is Victor Hugo. If you want to see Dumas versus high romanticism, look to Victor Hugo, who uses very big language, very philosophical digressions in his work. He uses a lot of moral symbolism at the forefront of his work, while Dumas is very much narrative propulsion. He's very dialogue, very action. We've called it cinematic here. And so all of those emotions, all of that passion is embedded in plot rather than in rhetoric. There's no soliloquies, no one's stepping aside and addressing the audience to philosophize on some tangent. So they're both, by this late period of the Romanticism movement, both are considered romantic. Romanticism is kind of splintered into multiple directions, where Hugo, the type of writer that Hugo and other Romanticism writers were, they want you to think, they want you to feel and contemplate, where Dumas wants that, but he also wants you to turn the page. He wants you to buy the next magazine, next newspaper that has the serialized part of his story in it so that he can make some money. In that way, Dumas is very modern and forward-thinking to today's writers and today's industry. He's almost prioritizing consumption of his stories as much as writing them. And that, I think, we've tipped into a direction that is far more about how do we get people to consume more than put stuff into the stories. Dumas feels like a really good balance between the two. But you can see with Dumas, go read two books by romantic authors back to back and see the difference between the two. It goes without saying that Dumas, when I read Three Musketeers, it was the first time in a long time that I'm like, I don't want to stop reading. I've been sitting here for 2.5 hours, page after page after page, and I don't want to put this book down. So that's Romanticism, and that segues me into talking about Auguste Mackay, who we will, I guess, get to tomorrow, finally. So, until then, get ready to have your minds blown, or at least I had my mind. Until then, okay, goodbye. The Countdown of Monte Cristo is part of the Gruntwork Podcast Network. This show is produced, edited, and hosted by Landon Solano. The original text of The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Theme song by Magic Solo. If you want to support the show and others like it, visit patreon.com/gruntworkpod. Thank you for listening. See you tomorrow.